He is able, more than able, to accomplish what concerns me today. He is able, more than able, to handle anything that comes my way. More than able, to do much more than I could ever dream. He is able, more than able, to make me what He wants me to be. He is able, accomplish what concerns me today. He is able, more than able, to handle anything that comes my way. He is able, more than able, to do much more than I could ever dream. He is able, more than able, to make me what He wants me to be.
Good morning, everybody. We are going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 16. We'll be starting off in verse 14 here in just a little bit. 1 Samuel 16. Just by way of review, last time we finished off chapter 14 looking at the big summary of Saul's family as well as Saul's accomplishments. Saul is going to be responsible for fighting against a lot of enemies, but not necessarily gaining a lot of ground for Israel, but making a really strong, centralized kingdom. So when we think about Saul's kingdom, think about mainly Benjamin and Ephraim, and his influence extends out of that, but that is his kingdom. That is the area that he controls, he protects, he is able to keep enemies out of, but the other areas, they're still kind of running rampant, and he's starting to pacify them, but not great. Once David comes on the scene, you're going to have much more success in pacifying those other nations and gaining into ground, but not until David fully becomes king does the region of Israel expand beyond Benjamin and Ephraim. David's going to take Judah first as his kingdom, and then ultimately he's going to take the rest of the tribes as his kingdom and control it, which is going to be a huge difference between him and Saul. In chapter 15, we saw the event that really sets Saul against God. Saul has been against God pretty well from the beginning. They've not really been allies. But this is the event, the non-destruction of Amalek, that they do not fully destroy that encampment. They do not fully kill everything. They bring back animals. They bring back Agag. And Samuel says, this is it. You've rejected God. You can't follow simple instructions. Therefore, God is not going to keep you as king. At that point, Samuel and Saul go their separate ways. They don't interact again until Samuel dies. Then they're going to interact again after Samuel dies. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so chapter 16, David is anointed king. We saw Samuel go down to Bethlehem. He encounters Jesse and his children. He goes through the whole process of going from the oldest down to the youngest until finally realizing that it's not even the youngest one that's presented. It's the youngest one way out there with the sheep that they have to go and find. That is going to become the next king of Israel. The last thing we talked about is verse 13 of chapter 16. Then Samuel took the horn of oil, anointed David in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward, and Samuel rose up and he went to Ramah. Now, I read that because verse 14 is going to give us the opposite of this. So what is the consequence of a new anointed being in Israel? The consequence is, in verse 14, the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him. ESV is a little more cautious. What are the other words that are used to describe this spirit? Evil, distressing. Even distressing gets a little cautious. Why do they not want to put the word evil? Yeah, God's not associated with evil. God can't send an evil spirit, but this one says an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him. And so it's got to be something else, right? It can't be an evil spirit. So last time we had a question about this. We're going to answer the question today. We're going to say words at the question today. You guys can decide if we answer the question. Because the problem is, we can understand the Spirit of the Lord coming upon someone. It's favorable, it's positive, and good things result from it. They gain power, they gain strength, they gain wisdom, they gain courage, they gain faith, they gain miraculous powers, but beneficial things happen when the Spirit of the Lord comes upon somebody. And you can see those examples all over the place, whether you go through the Judges, all the way up until the book of Acts, and you're looking at the works of the apostles and the early church. The Spirit of the Lord coming upon somebody is a beneficial thing. We don't have any problem with that. We don't think that God is taking away their free will with that. But in one respect, he is. When the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon someone, like it's going to rush upon David here in chapter 17 when he fights Goliath, it's making David think he can do things that normally David cannot do. That is a loss of free will. That is a God interacting directly in the life of an individual. Or we think of Samson. God interferes in Samson's free will all over the place. Because if you look at the life of Samson, Samson is kind of a worthless person. I don't know why we glorify him like we do. He's an awful human being. But then the Spirit of the Lord comes upon him and he does great and awesome works. You want to talk about changing the character of a man. That's a great change of character. Yes?
Of course, just by anointing him.
Yeah.
Because he spends the next however many years with Saul going, no, this guy needs to die. He was in the field with sheep. That would never have happened had God not said, no, boom, you're the king now.
Yeah. So we can see that from a favorable side. We can see it changes their lives, it changes their character, it changes a whole bunch of stuff. So let's look at the other side of this. Give me some other times besides Saul in Scripture where God sends, if you don't want to go so far as to say an evil spirit, God influences by giving his spirit in some fashion to an individual that produces a negative. I got some hands here. Oh, I got a whole bunch of hands here in the front. I got hands I don't know where to start. They all just went up. That's a great question. Okay, we're going to start this way. We're going to work our way to the right, okay? Leprosy. Naaman got plagued with leprosy. Okay, that's an interesting one. And we see the process of it going away. Yes?
You see that God gives his power pretty often to kings of Gentiles in order to punish his people. So you could look at it that way, that it's not necessarily maybe an evil spirit, but he is giving them power over Israel in order to punish them.
Okay, so looking at the Spirit of the Lord being given to Nebuchadnezzar, I know it was Sennacherib gets his ability. I think you were the next one.
I was thinking of Pharaoh, that God hardens his heart.
Pharaoh, God hardens his heart. That's a great one. Doesn't use the word spirit at all, but God had to have done something that modified the character of Pharaoh in a negative fashion. Okay, next. Okay, next.
I mean, one of the prime examples where God is allowing it, but in total control of it, is Job.
Job is a perfect example, and I'm glad you brought up Job, because Job was in my list. You want to read the first couple of chapters of Job, and you have an interaction between God and Satan, where God says, hey, have you ever seen Job? Not Satan. God says it. And Satan's like, well, yeah, you've made a hedge around him. Of course he's going to follow you. And so God says, fine, you go do stuff to him. If that's not God sending an evil spirit, I don't really know any other way to put it. Yeah.
And I'm curious about that because I see it a little differently, as we all have different aspects in our personality that, like with Saul, again, sight behind the luggage and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
He cited that certain aspect and brought it out.
Yeah.
David, clear eyes, heart, whatever, and he saw aspects of that human being and brought them out. I don't know if it's a modification so much as an enhancement.
Yeah, that's the word I was just thinking. Which is a modification of a sort. It's a increasing. We'll put it as an increasing. But yeah, that's a good comment too. I got one here, and then Ashley. And then I got to look to this side.
It's not a specific example, but when I read what God does with Saul here, I think about Romans 1:28, where Paul tells us there's this group of people, and he says very directly, very actively that God gave them up. God had intervened on Saul's behalf in giving him his spirit. Saul continued over and over again to demonstrate himself unworthy and to choose the other side, the bad. And so now God has removed that spirit and just basically turned Saul over to the worst parts of himself. That's how I think about it.
Very good. Ashley?
We put Judas there.
Okay, Judas is an interesting example of that. His is much more complicated. But yes, I think you could probably put him in there as well. I got to look to this side, and then I'll come back, because I'm ignoring this whole half of the auditorium. Anybody over here have any comments? Well, come on now. I gave you your chance.
9:23, God sent an evil spirit between Abimelech.
Exactly. Between Abimelech and the people of Shechem, I think it is. Yeah, I wrote that one down too. And that one's the same words. God sends an evil spirit between the two so that they would fight each other, so that there would become conflict between them once again. Yes. Okay, I'm back to you.
Well, I don't know that this exactly fits, but we have trouble using it and applying it. But Romans talks about how God sends the governing authorities. So he uses even evil men for his purposes and rulers even today. So I'm not worried about who's in charge, whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden or even Vladimir Putin, because ultimately God is the one who has those governing authorities, and his purpose is going to be served.
Yes, and I think that is the conclusion of this discussion, is that at the end of the day, if God chooses to use an evil spirit to fulfill his purposes, or if he chooses to use a righteous spirit to fulfill his purposes, at the end of the day, it is his purposes that are going to be fulfilled.
So he commented on earlier that God is not evil, and I do not believe in any form, fashion, that he has an evil nature about him. But there's things that God has done, and we read about it, of causing entire cities to die. Yeah. And other people's mind look at it, that's kind of evil. But we also call it as righteous judgment against someone. Using whatever devices like that to affect that.
Yeah. I'll give you one more example. Oh, I got Lee first.
Might not be what you're looking for or thought about, but the fallen angels.
Okay. Fallen angels, yeah. What about the fallen angels?
Cast out of heaven. They had an evil spirit.
Yeah. So they chose evil to be separate from God. Yeah. Another example you can look at is 1 Kings 22, 13 to 23. There, a prophet of God comes and tells Ahab, God has sent lying spirits to all of your prophets to entice you to go to Ramoth Gilead so that you'll be killed. Can't really get around that one. Like, that prophet is pretty specific. God sent lying spirits to do this very thing. So, God sending a spirit for the purpose of a negative, from our perspective, happens all over in Scripture. And so when we get down to what does it mean that God sent an evil spirit to torment Saul, it's what it sounds like. God sent a spirit whose entire purpose is to trouble, to distress, and to produce wrong direction for Saul. That's his whole purpose.
Where is it in the New Testament that it says God will give people up to their desires? You know,
Where?
It's Thessalonians. I just started.
Is it Thessalonians?
I think so.
The question is, where in the New Testament does it say God will give them up to their desires?
Something.
I wanted to say
That was what I wrote, Romans 1:28.
Romans 1:28. I
It
know.
says he turned them over.
Yeah, I think there's one where deluding the spirit, right?
What I'm looking for is 2 Thessalonians 2, 11. And for this reason, God will send upon them a deluding influence, so that they might believe what is false, in order that they all may be judged.
Yeah. So God's been very consistent. He does it in Judges. He's doing it, he did it all the way back in Exodus. He does it in Judges. He does it in 1 Samuel. He does it in the Kings. He does it in Romans. He does it in Thessalonians. He does it today, because that's the logical conclusion of all of this discussion. Yeah.
And I think to what Mike was saying, I think kind of on a meta level, we are uncomfortable with stuff like this because it doesn't fit our idea of what good and evil looks like.
Yeah.
When in reality, God is good, and so what he does is good, full stop. And if we're uncomfortable, we need to change the way we think about it.
Yes.
Rather than trying to play with words and redefine.
Exactly. Exactly right. All right. Anybody else have any thoughts? Because we spent 15 minutes on one verse, but I wanted to because this is an important verse. Yes.
There's another part of this story about God that's kind of difficult that we covered last week but didn't touch on, where Samuel tells Saul that God doesn't regret, and then a few verses later the writer of Samuel in commentary says God regretted that he made Saul king.
Yeah.
And so you just have, there's so many aspects of God that are that are kind of like and sort of like, and we're always trying to take our very limited mind and apply them to unlimited power, and you're never going to figure it out.
Yeah. exactly right. All right, I don't see any other hands. Well, let's see hands, but nobody's raising them. Okay, so let's read on. Let's look at the result of God sending this spirit to Saul. So verse 15, Saul's servant said to him, "Behold, now a harmful spirit from God is tormenting you. Let our Lord now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is skillful in playing the lyre, and when the harmful spirit of God from God is upon you, he will play it, and you will be well." So Saul said to his servants, "Provide for me a man who can play well, and bring him to me." One of the young men answered, "Behold, I have seen a son of Jesse, the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in playing, a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a man of good presence, and the Lord is with him." Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, "Send me David your son who is with the sheep." And Jesse took a donkey laden with bread and a skin of wine and a goat, and sent them by David his son to Saul. And David came to Saul, entered his service. Saul loved him greatly. He became his armor-bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, "Let David remain in my service, for he has found favor in my sight." And whenever the harmful spirit from God was upon him, David took the lyre and played it with his hands. So Saul was refreshed and was well, and the harmful spirit departed from him. Okay. Would we take a look at the stories here in 16 and 17 and into 18? There's going to be a lot of stories of David. And David with Saul, and it's going to kind of be confusing and weird because these are stories to tell us about David. That's why they're there. They're not there to tell us chronologically what happened. They're not there to lead us from point A to point B. They're there to tell us this is David in the beginning. This is how he interacted with Saul. This is what his life was like. These are some of the things he did. And then we're going to get to some chronological. Then we're going to go back to telling the full tale of, okay, it's going to go from Saul hates him, he's running, he lives with the Philistines, he's in the wilderness. Then we're going to get some more chronological stories coming up. But this is like bam, 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 bam. We're just going to get you a whole bunch of stuff. It's all going to happen pretty quick. It may have happened in the order that it's said. It may not have happened in the order that it's said. Because the point of the writer is not to tell a chronological story. It's like we get Genesis chapter 1, and Genesis chapter 2 tells us some more detail, and Genesis chapter 3 tells us more detail. That's the kind of event we're looking at here. And then it snapped back in Genesis to back to chronological, telling us that story again. So that's what we're looking at here. One of the stories the writer of 1 Samuel wants us to know is that after the anointing, but before David is truly out there and well-known and hated by Saul, he's brought in as a companion to Saul. So Saul has the harmful spirit. The direct consequence of the Spirit of the Lord going upon David is that it can no longer be upon Saul. It stays on one anointed at a time. God has removed it from Saul. The servants of Saul come up with a plan. If we can find somebody who plays good music, it might calm you down, kind of give you some centering, and allow you to work through this spirit that has come upon you from the Lord. Saul likes the plan. They find David, and David comes. That's it. It works. In this story, we're told David's going to become his armor bearer. We're told Saul knows his name. But in the next story, he doesn't. And so that's why all of these are kind of happening at the same moment, but Saul's not really learning who David is. After the death of Goliath, he does seem to know pretty well who David is. That's kind of a big sticking point. But if you're just talking about a guy who's given honor as an armor bearer, probably not Saul's only armor bearer because he's king. This is probably a title rather than necessarily the specific one. And he's given role as a music player. He's not a name that Saul's really going to remember. He's not a person Saul's really going to remember at this stage in the development. Yes?
He's working in the fields. He doesn't know anything about court and running a kingdom. So Saul is training him. He's teaching him about the ways of court and the ways of being a king. He's an armor bearer. He's still at the bottom rung as far as it goes in court. But it's more, we would know nothing. If we were taken all of a sudden to a king's court, we would not know.
Yeah.
And if we were told that all of a sudden that's going to be my job, that would be overwhelming. So God is training him a little at a time. And so very first, I'm sure he's terrified to be in this new situation with all these new people. He's got to learn a whole new job. He's got to learn what people do. So God is training him from the bottom up to learn about running the kingdom.
Yeah. And he does have some experience, because the servants do describe him as a man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech. So he's not quite as young as he was a few verses ago, but he's not quite as old as he's going to be. So that's why it's hard to really place these. It's just hard. It's just hard. So I think it's folly to try to say that they are in order. That's my opinion, though. Any other thoughts? Yeah, and then Mike.
That bothers me when I read this passage on Samuel. God criticized Samuel because he said, "I've made a decision and you're going against it." You know, and I think God's working every day in this world. And I wonder sometimes if I don't like some things that are going on, maybe God is causing those things to go on. I need to be careful. It's kind of like the Sanhedrin when they looked at persecuting the apostles. One Sanhedrin said, "You know, we better be careful because we may be going against God's wishes here."
Yeah.
And I think we have to think about, you know, God has a plan, and we need to be careful sometimes about our plan might not match God's.
Very true. It's fine.
I just find this interesting, just a little bit of verse where you're talking about Samuel and bringing in David. The fact of the matter, the transition just happened. David's been anointed king. The Spirit rushes upon him. He comes away from Saul. But he brings David into this, and Saul is oblivious, doesn't even know that. Apparently from this, does not know that David's been anointed as the next king.
Yeah. Yeah, again, it's very, the narrative of the story is well designed. I mean, the whole we know things that the characters don't know. Saul doesn't know the anointings happened yet, and yet, look, they're interacting with each other. It's very true. Very true. Okay, I think they put up, yes, they did put up my timeline here. We're about to talk about David and Goliath, and so you can kind of see a little bit of the organization. I forgot to get my clicker. So you can see the organization of the timeline that I'm using. You're welcome to disagree with it. I do sometimes, so you know. But we're down here now, 1024, give or take a little bit. You mean, argue with it if you want. So Saul became king sometime around 1043. We're looking at, what is that, 19 or so years he's been king. If I did my math correctly, you're welcome to correct me in that too. So it's been a while. At this point, the Spirit of the Lord is leaving Saul and going on to David. So he's had the Spirit of the Lord for quite some time. He's had some successes. He's well established. But in order for God to continue to allow Saul to have victories, David really has to get into the picture because the Spirit of the Lord has to be involved. And so that's one of the reasons that at this point, 1 Samuel, the writer of 1 Samuel gives us the David and Goliath story. Because how can Saul, who no longer has the favor of the Lord, who no longer has the Lord's Spirit, and who has an evil spirit, how can he keep winning battles? How can he keep having victory? How can he continue to move forward? It's because David's doing it now. And so there's our huge shift. From 17 onward, David becomes the reason Israel stays as Israel, and Saul becomes further and further and further and further removed until ultimately he's killed. Okay, any comments before we get to 17? I can guarantee you we're not getting to 18 today. But in 17, we start the story of David and Goliath. To bring my map back up here, we've got the two armies. The Philistines have gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah. They encamp between Soko and Azekah in Ephes Damim. Saul and his people have camped in the valley of Elah. So we're talking about right down in this region here. So again, notice where are these battles taking place. Almost all of the battles we've seen take place right here. Except for the one down here in Amalek that came over here. But almost all of them are right here between the Philistines and Saul. And in this case, it's going to be the Philistines and Saul and David. So David's going to enter into our picture here. They've drawn up with each other. If you've been in a Bible class as a kid, you know this story. If you've been in a Bible class as an adult, you know this story. If you have kids, you know this story. If you've walked down the hallway in a church anywhere, you've probably seen pictures of this story. Many of you have seen cutouts of Goliath on the wall to show you how big he is. Like, this is the Old Testament story. Like, you want to pick one? It's this one and Joseph. Those are the two. But the story of David and Goliath is fascinating for how it sets up David. So I'm not going to spend a great amount of time on a lot of the details because I do think this one's pretty well known. If you have a question, let me know. But it's pretty well known. Even people who don't know the Bible know the story of David and Goliath. We have a whole phrase in English about David and Goliath. So anyways. So we've got them on one side, one on the other. They're having battles between each other, but no one is truly winning here. This is fairly common for ancient warfare, where they would array themselves, they shout at each other, we're going to have a champion come forward. Whether the champion is responded to or not, they're still going to have a fight. They're going to come down, they're going to clash shields for a little bit, they're going to fight for a couple of hours, they're going to retreat. Some people are going to be killed, but unless it's decisive, neither army really wants to commit to a long, prolonged fight all day long, day in and day out. They just don't. Neither side wants to die. Like, it's just what it is. And so in the ancient world, we see a lot of lopsided fights. Anytime that a fight is truly recorded, it's like, we lost 30, they lost 300,000. Because that's how the fights worked. If you're not chasing them, then you break up and you go back and we're going to try again tomorrow. Like, that's what we're going to do. But we also have the champion contest. Very popular in the ancient world, all over the place. We can see it even written in places like the Iliad, which takes place, the Trojan War takes place about 200 or so years prior to the events we're talking about here, if we've got it anchored correctly. So it's fairly common for the champion to come forward, asking for a champion, making promises, saying that we don't really need to fight if the champions can settle it, because it boils it down to the gods themselves. One person against one person is truly the gods deciding here. Because on a battlefield, who knows what happens? Accidents happen all the time, but those two, the gods can influence it. So we're introduced to the Goliath, the champion of the Philistines. He is Goliath of Gath. He stands at 6 cubits in a span. What is that? 9 or so feet, give or take. He has a helmet of bronze on his head. His coat is a coat of mail. The weight of the coat is 5,000 shekels. He has bronze armor on his legs, a javelin of bronze slung between his shoulders. The shaft of his spear is like a weaver's beam. The spear's head weighs 600 shekels of iron. His shield bearer goes up before him, and he shouts out. He is incredibly powerful looking. Like just his greave, you could probably put on David's chest and he could call it a breastplate. Like he is totally armored of his day. And he even has his shield bearer, his standard bearer, walking before him saying, look how awesome this man is. He shouts out and he says, why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he's able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistine says, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard the words, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. There is language missing here that we do see from earlier battles. And the language is the Philistines don't mention God. Think about, for example, what's going on during the Philistine wars that Saul fights initially. There's a great shout that comes up, think back to Eli's day. There's a great shout that comes up in the camp when the Ark of God comes in, and they say, oh no, the Lord is there. We see Jonathan going up, talking about God, talking about things that are going on. He makes no mention of the gods of Israel. No mention of God against God. He is literally Philistine against king. And it may be that Saul doesn't talk a whole lot about God. The Israelites don't talk a whole lot about God. In a little bit, David's really going to be the only one that brings up God in this entire story. Nobody else really talks about God at all. Okay, we're introduced to David again. Third time reintroduced to David. David in verse 12 is the son of an Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had followed Saul to battle, and the names of his 3 sons who went to battle were Eliab the firstborn, Abinadab the second, and Shammah the third. David was the youngest, and the 3 eldest followed Saul. David stays and goes back and forth from Saul back to feed his father's sheep, and for 40 days this has been going on. And nothing's really being decided here with the battle. One commentator I read posits that these are well-known stories of David that the writer of 1 Samuel just wrote down. So when somebody tells the story of David, now there was a man who's the son of Jesse, and they tell the story of David and Goliath. There was a man, the son of Jesse, who served as the musical instrument, the lyre wielder in the court. Or this is the son of Jesse, and this is how he was anointed. And so that's one of the reasons why they're kind of repetitive in how these stories are written, because they would have been very common tales. Any comments before we get into 17? Not really a whole lot going on just yet. Okay. In 17, Jesse says to his son, to David, take for yourselves and take for your brothers an ephah of parched grain and these 10 loaves, carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000 for a bribe. And see if your brothers are well and bring some token back from them. So this is why David is in the camp. He should be with the sheep, but this is why he is back in the camp. So he's going to come from over here in Bethlehem, not all that far to get to this region right here. He can pretty easily run. They could probably hear shouting and clashing on a nice, cool day if the breeze is in the right direction. David arrives. It tells us in verse 17 that Saul and all of them, all the men of Israel, they're in the valley of Elah. They're fighting with the Philistines. David rises early in the morning. He leaves the sheep with the keeper. He takes the provisions, and he comes to the encampment. He comes to the encampment just as they're going out to fight. They're going to the battle line. They're shouting their war cry. Israel and the Philistines have drawn up for battle, army against army. David leaves the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage. He runs into the ranks to greet his brothers. I just love the image here. Like, you want to talk about a child? This is a child's behavior. Everyone is lined up ready for war. Shields, spears, swords, helmets, ready. And here comes the little kid running through the ranks. Like, I'm looking for my brothers. Where's my brothers? Like, you can just see the child of him as he's running through the ranks, and with the glee of all children reading of ancient battles. And seeing the wonder and the glory and the honor that is being made here. But while all that's going on, and he's running out there into the army in order to greet his brothers before the battle starts, the champion Goliath comes out and speaks, and David hears it. He hasn't found his brothers yet. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, they fled from him and were much afraid, meaning that they probably cowered back rather than fully run away. Because they're still arrayed in their battle lines for the rest of this story. It said, the men of Israel, in verse 25, and the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches, and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel. David said to the men who stood with him, what shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him, and so it shall be done to the man who kills him. Now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David and said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? And he turned away from him toward another and spoke in the same way, and the people answered him again as before. Okay. Child David. I love child David. Child David is so child. Because look at the interaction here. He hears the words. The people start to say, look, if somebody would just take care of this guy, Saul would really reward him. And what does David's, I'll come to you, I see, yeah. What is David's response? He's like, what's he going to get? What's going to happen if somebody comes up and kills the Philistines, takes away the reproach of Israel? Who is this uncircumcised? You can see him posturing, can't you? That little balls of the feet bounce. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine? Who is this guy that he should come and defy the armies of the living God? First time God's mentioned. All right. Yes. I don't know. He seems to be before the age of 20 because he's not with the rest of them. But only the 3 oldest brothers are there. And he's got, how many brothers? 7? 6? There's 7 brothers. So only the 3 oldest are at war. So it makes me wonder if the next ones are still too young to go. That would put David 14, 15, given an average. Yeah. Perfect time for gutsy, bouncing on the balls of his feet. I can take on a whole college basketball team by myself. I can do it. He's 15. Like, you can hear it. All of you who have had kids, think of your 15-year-old boys. He's 15. I can conquer the world. His brother hears this, his eldest brother, and he is infuriated, as most brothers would be. Can you just imagine? Here you are, you're here with your college basketball team, and your brother's over in their stands like, do better. You'd be ticked at him. Because that's exactly what's happening. He walked in here, and he's like, I don't understand why anybody's scared of this guy. Why are you guys a bunch of cowards? Yeah.
Like they were present when Samuel anointed David. They had to sit through, is it me? No. Is it me? And then they called in their youngest brother, and so they knew that he was anointed. Having raised boys, I would imagine that this would cause a little jealousy.
A lot of issues between them. A very Joseph and his brothers aspect. Yes.
Eliab didn't say anything until David started to show himself as really not afraid of this guy.
Yeah.
And I think Eliab maybe was afraid of this guy, and this kind of upset him a little bit.
Yes.
Because when he first came, it said that he greeted them, or they greeted him, and that goes on. And then when he says something about Goliath, that's when Eliab gets upset.
Yes, you're exactly right. And look at Eliab's responses here. Why have you come down? I know why you're here. I know that you're just here because you're evil and you just want to see this battle. That's the only reason you're here. You just need to go home to your little sheep. I love that. Where have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? Just go home to the sheep. Let the adults handle this. But David, in true younger brother fashion, just ignores him. He just turns and he's like, hey, you over there, is it true that I'll get a bunch of rewards if I go kill that guy? You can just imagine. The story is so rich. You can just see it in your mind's eye as David's just wandering through the battlefield, as they're all getting ready to go to war, and he's just like, hey, all you got to do is kill that guy and you get a bunch of rewards? I can kill that guy. And so that's exactly what he does. In verse 31, any comments before I get to 31? Okay, so in 31, when the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, and he sent and he found him. David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine. And Saul says to David, you're not able to go fight this Philistine. You are but a youth, and he has been a man of war from his youth. David said, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. I love that. ESV says used to. Think of what David just said there. His brother says, go back and take care of your sheep. Early in the story, he is a shepherd. But he's not a shepherd anymore. David's mind, he says, I used to keep sheep. Okay. When there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and I struck him and I delivered it from his mouth. If he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God. I would submit to you that some time has passed between his anointing and now, and that is when these events are taking place. Because this is fresh in his mind, and it is different. This is not something that Eliab can do. This is not something that Abinadab can do or Shammah could have done. This is unique to David. That David has no fear. None whatsoever. He's also a teenager, so that also helps. But no fear whatsoever. Yes?
God-inspired, God-infused warrior.
Yeah.
Because of the way you talk about how great you are as a warrior, have you killed a lion and a bear with your bare hands? And so Samson kills a lion with his bare hands. Hercules kills a lion with his bare hands. God sends lions and bears, oh my, as a way to punish people, and yet the way you overcome with God's powers, you kill lions and bears. So
Yes.
that's a really rich statement. It's not braggadocious. He is, like you pointed out, he's talking about how he has the Spirit of God.
Yeah. Even one of David's men of valor, it's going to say he is one who killed a lion in a pit on a snowy day. Like, you want to talk about hard. Like, that one gets down even harder. And he kills him with a club. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Okay, let's get a little further. So they're continuing their discussion here. David has laid out his own credentials. In verse 37, David says, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me also from the hand of the Philistine." And Saul says to David, "Go, the Lord be with you." First time Saul says this in this story. David said it a handful of times, but Saul also now mirroring back the same language. I don't think that Saul really has a strong connection to the Lord, but mirroring the language, "The Lord be with you." Because after all, it is their national God. Saul clothes David with his armor. He tries to put it all on him. It doesn't really go very well because David's not really used to it. He's not fitted for it. I mean, can you just imagine? David's an average height guy. Saul's an abnormally tall guy. We're going to put his armor on. It just doesn't work. It doesn't work. So David takes them all off. He goes, he chooses 5 smooth stones from the brook, puts them in his hand, or in his shepherd's pouch, and he goes out with sling in hand and staff in hand. So when you think about slings, I don't know about you, but I remember in Bible class that I thought they were like this big, the little rocks that were being flung. The rocks that we found that were used by slingers are about the size of a tennis ball. And so probably that's what he is going to get, is smooth stones from the brook that are the size of a tennis ball. Makes a little more sense why you get hit in the head with that, anybody's going to go down. I mean, yes, we've got some God impact here as well, but slings were incredibly, incredibly deadly in the hands of a skilled opponent. So much so that when I think Assyria is the one that prioritizes sling warfare over archery because they found the sling to be more advantageous in war than they found the bow and the arrow. So just think about that perspective. So a well-trained slinger like David, also adding in the fact that he has the Spirit of the Lord on top of him, and so he can, in war, do really no wrong. Definitely, Goliath doesn't stand a chance. He just doesn't stand a chance. Okay, any comments before we talk about 41? Yes.
I think a lot about verse 37, where David, thinks about his experience with the lion and the bear, and it's just, in his mind, Goliath is next.
Yeah.
And you talked about Jonathan and his armor bearer and their plan, and how David, the plans of a child. And I think about, things, decisions, good decisions that I've made in my life where I took big risks. And I did it because I had no experience. I didn't know any better. But I did it. And so I think about David here and his view and the way he recounts the way God has helped him. And that's something that I want to emulate. And seeing all the specific things God has done for me, and then taking the experience that I now have as an older man and gaining wisdom without gaining worry. That's something I think about a lot, because we accumulate experience as we live, and it's really easy to, with that experience, to turn it into worry instead of thinking about all the good things God has done for us and how that experience can help us now.
That's a really good comment. Strong comment from David especially. Anything else? Cool. Let's get a little further. 41. The Philistine moves forward. He comes near to David. His shield bearer is in front of him. The Philistine looks, and he's filled with disdain. You sent out this kid. He's ruddy, he's handsome, but he's a child. The Philistine says, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine says, come to me and I will give you your flesh to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. Sometimes we separate those two phrases, that he cursed him by his gods, and then he says something in 44. That is an ancient curse. Come to me and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field is an ancient curse. And so when it says cursed by the gods, that's what he's done. You're not going to be buried. Your soul will wander without anchor because you are not taken care of in death. That is a huge curse in the ancient world if your burial was not done appropriately. So David's going to respond back to him in verse 45. David says, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts and the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. I will strike you down and cut off your head. I will give the dead bodies of the hosts of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air and to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. He says, I heard your curse, and I'm going to one-up it. You're going to leave my body here for the birds of the air and the beasts of the field? I'm going to leave all of your bodies here. Man, the confidence of youth, right? I'm going to drop all of you, and you're all going to be cursed, so that everybody knows God is God. So they come. 48, the Philistine arose. He comes and he draws near to David. David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand in his bag. He took out a stone. He slung it. He struck the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank deep into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the ground. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine, and he killed him. There was no sword in the hand of David. Then David ran, and he stood over the Philistine, and he took his sword and drew it out of its sheath and killed him and cut off his head. Cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. The men of Israel and Judah arose with a shout and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron, so that the wounded Philistines fell on the way from Sha'arim as far as Gath and Ekron. And the people of Israel came back from chasing the Philistines. They plundered their camp, and David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. And we'll stop there. So, the clash is not really much of a clash, because before Goliath can get within much range, David drops him with a stone. David runs up and cuts his head off, just like he promised to do so, and everybody flees. And so the bodies litter the ground. I mean, we're talking about quite a bit of space here. If they're fighting around here near Jarmuth, and they're going to flee all the way to Gath and Ekron, dying along the way, no one's coming back to bury these men. The Israelites have penned the Philistines up in their cities. They're not going to let them come out and bury them. They are given to the birds of the air and to the beasts of the field. David fulfilling his promise and demonstrating that the Lord is powerful. David then comes back. He takes the head and brings it to Jerusalem, ultimately by way of Saul, but he also puts all of the armor in his own tent. You want to talk about going from nothing to wealthy? That's nothing to wealthy. It's these kids today making millions of dollars off YouTube, and their older children are just now finishing, or their older siblings are just now finishing college and going to make $35,000. Like, it's hard. I can only imagine the response that his brothers are going to have to this event now. It's going to be unbearable in the house of Jesse. Any comments anybody has before we finish the chapter? Okay. As soon as Saul saw David go out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, as your soul lives, O king, I don't know. And the king said, inquire whose son the boy is. And as soon as David returned from striking down the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, whose son are you, young man? And David answered, I am the son of your servant, Jesse the Bethlehemite. Okay, end of story. Then we're going to get next story in chapter 18, where we're going to have some true interactions between Saul and David. But at this stage, they're just flabbergasted. They just no idea what to think of this kid. He comes out of nowhere. He's not of an ancient warrior lineage. He's not some super awesome, powerful guy. If the first story actually happens before Goliath, then they might recognize him as a guy who plays really good music. That's it. Like, literally, the lead singer of Aerosmith just went out there and killed Goliath. Like, that's, what in the world? Like, that, he's not a soldier? Was that Steven Tyler? I got there. Yeah, no, we would be flabbergasted, wouldn't we? If he goes to Ukraine and leads them to victory, like, we would just be like, what? What in the world? So anyways, we'll pick up with chapter 18 next time, and we're going to get into the next lesson a little bit, probably 19 and 20. So be ready with that as well. Any final thoughts before I release y'all? Okay, be gone.
I have seen